Anu, thanks for joining the call. We're pretty excited about this interview. Just to kind of talk a little bit about Anu's background, Anu is actually a UX designer at Publicis Sapient. And previously, he used to be a UX designer for IBM. And he's throughout his career, he's done a lot of UI and UX work, created a lot of success, done a lot of trainings for UX. So we're really excited to learn about the mindset of UX and learn from his experience. So Anu, welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah, so tell us about your story. How did you land into UX role?
Yeah, so when I was back in college, I was actually studying industrial design, which is similar to UX, just dealing more with physical products. So industrial design, learning how to design anything like from furniture to TVs, cell phones, cars, anything physical. Mm-hmm. And through my internships and all that, I realized I loved what I did, but when I saw the reality of what that's like professionally, it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. But I realized that UX and the whole digital space was a lot more interesting to me, and I could mesh these kind of two interests. And I was able to design, but at a much faster pace because digital, everything can happen much more quickly than, old school manufacturing.
Yeah.
So that's how that transition happened. And luckily I went to a university that was very tech heavy and had a lot of opportunities and like hackathons and things like that to just kind of learn, try things out, and just kind of naturally self-taught myself with a lot of the tools, and just got a job out of college doing UX design.
Yeah, and you went to Carnegie Mellon, right?
Yep. Yeah, went to Carnegie Mellon.
Perfect. Yeah, so tell us about the process of finding your first job and what it's like to be in your first team.
Yeah, so the process was, definitely hard, as often is coming out of college. Yeah. But it was definitely interesting and one of those big things. And I think a lot of people actually have this issue in the UX field because there's more, but still there's not that many places where you can go and get a major in UX design.
Yeah.
Most people are majoring in something similar. So like myself, industrial design, or maybe graphic design, some people even like psychology, different areas. And then they make a transition to UX design. So a big question in like interviews that I had to learn how to answer is, why are you a UX designer? You didn't study this.
Yeah.
Which is always a crazy question to me because I feel like no one did.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was definitely hard, but I ended up getting a few offers and found one that I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And that was at IBM?
At IBM, yeah.
Yep.
So I got offer and started working at IBM in New York.
Yeah. So can you share a little bit more about like and you said you work in an Agile team. So what was the team like and what was your involvement going into a team as a new UX designer? What was that like for you?
Yeah, definitely. So the team that I joined, it was basically, we had the whole engineering team, a very, very large engineering team. And we were the first designers in that entire organization. To kind of put that in context, the part of IBM that I was joining I think it is the oldest part of the company.
Oh, wow.
And so it makes the most money for the company.
Yeah.
But it's also needed a lot of help from a design perspective.
Sure.
So they're bringing us on as the first designers. And we were a team of about 5 designers. So we consisted of UI designers, mostly UX designers, and 1 design researcher. So that was the team makeup. And like Vivek said, we practice Agile. And the way we actually implemented that was a little bit different than I think the way most people do, is where we realized that our design team just wouldn't mesh well with the current engineering team.
Yeah.
who did not practice Agile.
Yeah.
But our design lead actually came from she taught Scrum basics and taught Agile classes and all of that. So she knew what she was doing.
Yeah.
So we were also kind of like this Trojan horse to introduce Agile into the organization. And so we started doing Agile, 2-week sprints, all of that. And we would, at the end of every 2 weeks, deliver design to engineering. And over time, we kind of got them into the flow of things, and they started doing 2-week sprints. Okay. And over time, we started coming closer together and being more in sync.
So this was like 5-6 UX designers and by person, and then you said a large development team. How large? Like
I personally interacted with maybe like 10 engineers.
Okay.
But there was I don't know how many hundreds in the background.
Oh wow. Yeah. So and then once they went into more of a Scrum delivery model, so they just formed smaller teams, and you got assigned to a team where you were working with them?
Yeah, so the way it worked is they formed smaller teams, like you said, but still it was still a few designers to so many engineers.
Yeah.
So we would basically, whatever projects were the highest priority for business, those were the projects that got design on them. So basically, we would usually be working on a few different projects across the product.
Yeah. And
so we'd be working with different teams and switch over back and forth and all of that. So it's very fluid.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. So let's just talk about UI, UX, and research. So what's the difference? There's a lot of misunderstanding about these three things. So can you share a little?
Yeah, definitely. So I think UI is probably the easiest to understand. UI is, what does the actual user interface look like? A UI designer is usually very good at color, typography, basically making things look really good, but not just making it look pretty, but making it, easy to understand especially in like a lot of enterprise applications like I've worked on. You're dealing with a lot of data, a lot of complexity, and organizing that in a way that's understandable. A UX designer is more concerned about the user and how they're going to interact with the product. So we're thinking a little bit bigger picture, where things go on the page, how the user flows through an experience, and looking at it a little bit more holistically. And then the last one, the design researcher, or sometimes called experience researcher, they're really concerned about doing that research. It can be anything from usability testing. So a UX designer makes a prototype, the researcher helps them write up a research study and puts it in front of users, maybe current customers or potential customers, and gets feedback on if it works the way that the designer intended it to work. But a design researcher can also be someone who kind of looks further out ahead and talks to customers and potential customers and is really looking at, okay, what can we do? What new features can we implement that will help grow the business and help our customers in whatever the space is?
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. So, so let's just kind of talk a little bit more about what you're doing right now. So right now you said you are working at a company called Publicis Sapient, and you're actually working out of the client side with the developers, most of the developers from the client. So you are a UX designer, part of a Scrum team. And you said you have one more developer from your company, right?
Yeah.
So what's the dynamics there, and what are some of the things that your guys are building right now? What are some of the challenges? Let's hear that.
Yeah. So it's definitely an interesting project where it's basically a website redesign, a very large, complex. It's a big bank. So one of the interesting things is that there's a large development team that we work with on the client side, but we have one developer from our agency side, and he is incredible. He's really talented, and he's kind of like what he works on is a prototype of what we want the site to be in the future. Mm-hmm. And so he's bringing in a lot more modern development practices, just better ways of working from a technology standpoint. Mm-hmm. And he's also there to help us designers try and understand better how can we help the larger development team move in a direction that's more modern. Because there's currently a lot of technical debt that's causing a lot of issues.
Yeah.
And not just for design to, make the website nicer, but just serious issues for the end clients who are dealing with the type of clients that this project is for. Multi-millionaires don't want their product experience to be bad. They have high standards, right?
Yes.
So that's been interesting for sure.
Yeah. So what's the process of kind of creating the shared understanding from between UX person and the developers? Because you are kind of thinking about how the look and the feel, how a customer is going to interact in that website, and the developers are in charge of actually coding it, right? So can you share a little bit more of that communication process, because you are the master communicator, right?
Yeah, and actually that's something that I realized when I first got onto this project, that I kind of got on midway, so it had already started, and I realized that there was definitely a kind of a division of like design and engineering, and there was a chasm between the two.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I've been trying to do is just kind of help bridge those a little bit better.
Yeah.
So obviously there's a lot of stuff that as a designer that I want to make happen that is very hard for engineering, because it will take a lot of effort because of that technical debt that I mentioned.
Yep.
So it's been a lot of kind of me pushing the engineers to stretch a little bit and do some things that are a little bit uncomfortable, that may be a little bit harder. And thankfully we have the product owners are also kind of put that pressure on. Mm-hmm. But it's also meant that I've had to, when a developer says that there's something that will be really hard and they've try to fix something, try to way around it to design it exactly how we want it, but they can't do it in the sprint, then being okay and being like, hey, don't worry about it, we'll take care of that later, and just kind of having some empathy for them.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think a lot of times us designers don't have. Yeah. And I've been trying to push the other designers on the team to try and understand the development side a little bit more. And I'm by far not a developer. I cannot code.
Yeah.
But I think I understand enough to know that it's not always as easy as it seems.
Yeah.
So anything that we can do to make development easier and more efficient, we will take some of that burden.
Yeah.
So that's definitely.
So in your role right now, so like what are some of the artifacts that you create? Is it using InVision? You just create an app and then kind of show it to developers. So what does that communication look like? Where do you do that? Do you just have a meeting where you just have a working session? Can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah. So usually what we do is when we, so if there's something we want to build, right? We write up a story, we put in Jira, and before it's pointed or anything, we sit down with the engineering team and we have maybe not finished design, but we have some early design mock-ups or something that we can show to them and say, hey, so this is what we're thinking, this is what the story is going to be, so that we can sit down and actually point things together.
Yeah.
And it'll be accurate, because what we realized is beforehand, everything was just wildly inaccurate.
Yeah.
So we would do that together. And as far as delivering that design, we use InVision.
Mhm.
And so as designers, we work in Sketch. We upload our designs to InVision, where engineers can then go in and use the inspect tool there and get all the specific pixel dimensions, colors, anything and everything that they need just through that one tool.
Nice.
And of course, there's always going to be some questions, and thankfully we do sit right around the corner from engineering.
Yeah.
So they just walk over, we walk over, they ping us on chat or whatever. So it's definitely a lot of, back and forth. But the other really nice thing a luxury that I have here on this project is that we have a dedicated prototyper. So there have been a few things that we were actually able to get out ahead of time, where he's actually prototyped something and had it working perfectly in code. And by the time the engineering team comes around, he already has this thing working. So They can look at that and know exactly how it should work and even copy some of the code straight up.
That seems like a luxury. I mean, big thanks. So
yeah.
So great. So let's, I actually wanted to ask you about design sprints. Can you kind of talk to us about what are design sprints? When do they happen? What happens in that? Can you share a little bit about design sprints?
Yeah, so the design sprints that I've done, this is mostly at IBM, where, like I was saying, when we started, the engineering team wasn't really doing Agile or anything. So the way we would work was we would have our design sprints, which are 2 weeks. At the end of those 2 weeks, we would deliver design. So these were, either wireframes that engineers could then take and start early prototypes, or they were nice, fully fleshed out mock-ups with color and everything that they could go and make the production versions of. So at the end of every 2 weeks, we'd deliver all of those artifacts to engineering, and then they would go and later on in their own sprints and actually turn that design into code.
Yep, perfect. Yeah, and then the other thing that I wanted to kind of dial into was you said that you have somebody who's more of a business analyst, product specialist, kind of a person in the team. So what's the interaction with that person? Like, how do you guys work together?
Yeah, so I personally haven't been working with him too much on this project yet. But from what I see, the other designers on the team who work much more closely with him, basically he's interfacing a lot with the business stakeholders in the project. So a lot of the product owners and people higher up, VPs and whatnot. But he brings, obviously, looking at all the data, analytics, and that perspective to the team. And he works we have actually 2 design researchers. And so he works with them to any kind of feature that we think we may need. They work together to figure it out, test it with users, and go back and forth and work with product owners to see if it's something we actually want to dedicate design and engineering time towards.
Yeah, and then the other question that I wanted to ask you is like, what's the relationship between UX designer and product owner? In what cadence do you guys talk? What do you guys talk about? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so right now the project I'm on, it's interesting where the product owners, I think it's kind of a new thing to have such a large design team that they're working with. And I think it's a lot of change for the organization. So it's definitely a lot of back and forth and them getting comfortable letting go some of the decisions. Because I think in this organization, the product owners have been used to making all the decisions that normally a UX designer would make, like what is the best way to present information on a screen, or what's the best way to the user flow should be. So it's been a lot of dialogue back and forth and slowly getting them to understand that UX design, or specialty or expertise is figuring out those details
Yeah.
and them kind of taking a step back and looking more holistically at the bigger picture.
Nice.
Yeah.
Another question that I have for you is, so let's just talk a little bit more about lean startup. Like, how do we, because you've done some UI work, you've consulted small businesses from a lean perspective. How do you know that you are building the right product, right? That's one of the big challenges that we have in a lot of teams. So can you share your perspective and if you have an experience about that?
Yeah, I mean, never really know if you're building it until you do it.
Yeah.
So like lean startup, and we're talking earlier about how, the lean startup is really just very close to what the entire design process is all about. And I can tell this one story about this project I worked on, this freelance project. This client, he came to me and he was looking for a designer to design this app that he was working on.
Yeah.
And he had already spent about $20,000, had paid this development engineering company to build this app, I think some Android app. And he had this app is working. I saw it. It was terrible.
Yeah.
I can't believe someone took that much money and that's what they delivered.
Yeah.
And so he had this thing and he was trying to go to hospitals and start to sell it as a app for medical communities. And I think he was realizing that it just wasn't good. So that's why he's looking for a designer.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came on, I kind of started talking to him about like, let's rethink this. Let's kind of take a step back and rethink it. Yeah. So he got me in front of some of the doctors that he was working with and he was good friends with, and kind of got a better idea of like what are the actual use cases, what were the user needs, what were the pain points, all the usual stuff that as a designer we do when we're doing the research. Mm-hmm. And through that, we realized a few things. One, that the current app that was built was just completely off base. Yeah. Two, we realized that, maybe the medical area is not the best area to focus on. Yeah. But either way, so I started designing it. So I started designing in Sketch, and I was using InVision, which is a design prototyping tool that's really quick, low cost, allows you to quickly make a prototype, a proof of concept. Mm-hmm. So within a couple of months, I was basically able to build a prototype that by the end of it, he realized that he wanted out of the medical field. He was sick of dealing with all that. Yeah. And either way, he realized that this type of product maybe would work better for small businesses. Mm-hmm. So I was able to tweak the app to do all that. Yeah. And I was able to deliver something to him for roughly $1,000 that he could take and give to small business owners he knew and just go and talk to them, put it in their hands. They could try it out and get feedback. And turned out down the road that it wasn't a good idea. But he only spent $1,000 to find that out versus the $20,000-$30,000 he paid to build a fully functioning app. So
that's a great testimony of delivering something lean and using lean startup, delivering something more of a minimum viable product to kind of validate the business need or validate the need for the product. Because one of the things that we see is we put so much time and energy and our passion into a product, but it's just when it's developed, nobody uses it, right? Especially companies. So that's great. I kind of want to pick your mindset on like whenever you're trying to research about a customer or trying to find out how they might be using the app, what do the user interview sound like, and what do they look like? What do the interaction look like? How do you set it up? How do you prepare the potential users? Can you kind of share a little bit more about that process, user interviewing?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of different types, or say there's two big kind of buckets that they fall under.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the more explorative user interviews where you don't really know exactly what you're trying to find out. You're just trying to ask probing questions.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the more usability where you have a prototype and you're testing to see if what you've built works.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're kind of more asking about the first one where you're trying to probe those bigger questions.
Yeah.
And so those are actually much harder to prepare for sure.
Right.
And it's really, every time I've done those, it's the entire team getting together. So design, engineering, business, everyone in the same room and just writing down a bunch of questions. So if we're all together in the same physical space, we do sticky notes, put them up and kind of organize them and see, you know, what are the kind of big ideas that we're trying to understand about our user.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're working remote, a couple of times we've done, you know, Google Docs or whatever, just put all the things in there. But just trying to understand what are the big ideas that we're trying to understand. What are we trying to get out of this?
Mm-hmm.
And then me or the designers will take all those questions, those big ideas,
mm-hmm.
and condense them down. And really, we're trying to keep it open-ended. You know, it's more of a conversation than an interview. So oftentimes we'll, you know, it's good when the customer, the user, just starts ranting about something.
Yeah.
That's usually when you know you've hit on something.
Yes.
And you know, sometimes it's hard because sometimes what they're ranting about may not be a space that you or your company really is interested in or can affect, or your team can really affect. So sometimes you do have to kind of push them around and direct them towards an area that you want. Mm-hmm. But it's really, really important to make sure, and I've seen this a lot, is to not ask leading questions.
Sure.
Because, and I think this is something that as designers, usually we're trained to do, but even we do it sometimes where we want that person to say the right thing, but there is no right thing.
Yes.
And there's plenty, you can just Google about how to make sure you're not asking leading questions. There's plenty of good stuff out there.
Yeah.
But that's something that, like, when we write up a whole interview questionnaire or whatnot, we always give it to another designer so that they can, you know, critique it and make sure we're not asking those questions.
Like more exploratory, probing questions.
Exactly.
So good, because I'm also interested in hearing, like, let's say, what if the user is clueless or he's not thinking about his problem correctly? Like, how do you engage in that conversation?
No, that's definitely one that has happened sometimes, and it can be kind of awkward or frustrating.
Yeah.
So something that I've done quite a few times before is when it's a space that's, and I think that happens a lot when it's a more technical space of whatever capacity, we try and, you know, write up the questionnaires, all the questions, and we try and run it by someone within the organization who is an expert at that area, who understands that area, so that we can ask them those questions and see if our questions are off base. Because usually it's, if that happens in an interview, it means that we're just not asking the right questions or the questions in the right way.
Sure.
Or there's also the chance that, and this has also happened before, where we just have the wrong person.
Yeah.
And in times where that's happened, we've just flat out said, like, hey, it seems like maybe you're not the person that, you know, we're really looking for. Is there someone else in your organization who you think would want to help out or want to talk to us or whatever? And, you know, put it in a way that will hopefully get you access to that right person.
Yeah. And then what does the usability side of things look like whenever you're doing that with the user, once you have the prototype? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so usually that's tied much more closely to some story that's we're working on. So will be a new feature, for example. The UX designer will mock something up, a wireframe, so not super high fidelity. And then we'll work with a design researcher, or in a lot of organizations, there is no dedicated researcher.
Yeah.
So they themselves will figure out, what about my design am I unsure about? And sometimes it'll come from external. So sometimes the product owner will be like, are you sure that this is the right solution? What about this? So they'll come up with a study. There's different ways of doing it. Maybe they do one prototype, maybe it's two different prototypes, testing two different ideas. There's many different ways of doing it. And then getting the users, which is another big thing, where depending on the industry you're in, sometimes it can be hard. But there's a lot of really good resources like Usertesting.com, which is amazing.
Okay.
Basically, you can just go onto there, sign up, and it's relatively affordable for the type of service it provides.
Nice.
And basically, they take care of actually running the studies, and you get back all of the recordings and transcripts and all of that. So you don't have to, especially as a smaller team, you don't have to waste as much time doing all of that.
Yeah.
And especially for usability testing, it's not as important for you to do it. I think for the more exploratory stuff, it is. But usability, you're just trying to get, metrics of how many people were able to complete the task, and where, if they're not, where were they tripping up?
Yeah, great. Another question I want to ask you, and the UX designer might hate me for this, but let's say in the Midwest, you don't have actually UX designer in the Scrum team, right? It's supposed to be a cross-functional team, but really there's no UX designer. In that case, what do you recommend? Obviously, the solution is getting a UX designer eventually, but what can the team do to kind of show the value of UX design? Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah. Like you said, ideally get a UX designer. But I think, and I have heard of a lot of instances where there's someone on the team who has to be the advocate and champion UX design, even if they're not a designer themselves. And I can tell you a story about the first team that I was on at IBM. The reason that we got hired on as that first design team was because one of the engineers there who had worked there a long time had somehow come across UX design and started getting interested in it, and basically started acting as a designer within that engineering team. And he knew he wasn't a great designer, but he was good enough that the larger team started to see that there was a very big difference between the stuff he and that team were producing, and the products that the rest of the organization were producing. Like, they were just better, they looked better, the actual customers were more excited about it. And so that kind of case study, that experience led the higher ups and executives to finally say, okay, we want to actually invest in design. And then they actually spent a lot of money to build a very large design team after that.
Yeah. So you're saying it doesn't have to be a developer, somebody who used to be a business analyst or a product person can learn some of the design work? Yeah.
I mean, anyone can learn a little bit and start to dabble in it, maybe do a little bit here and there. And there's definitely plenty of, meetups and whatnot going around in, most major cities. And definitely a lot online. You just Google or go on YouTube. There's a million different things on there. But yeah, there's definitely a lot. And I think the biggest one, though, is that just less than the technical side of like how to use the different design tools. I think the biggest part is more about how to think like a designer. And I think that's probably the hardest thing. But like I said, there's a lot of good stuff on Stanford D School has some interesting courses. I think they're free online as well about design thinking and how to start thinking in that way. And those could be a really good way to start.
Yeah. So in your case, like how does somebody actually curate a design thinking mindset, or like how do you cultivate that thought process? Like what was that? You went to school for that. I mean,
Yeah.
you're schooling, but like if you had to do it without going to school, like would you have been able to do it? I know a lot of people go from graphics to design. What are some of those thought processes that a UX designer should have?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing, the biggest thing that sets apart a designer from an engineer or business analyst or product owner or whoever is that for a designer, what they care about the most is that end user, like the human being who is using whatever the product or service is. And that's what they care about. That's the person they care about. And while an engineer may think about, how can I make this the most efficient code possible? A product owner is probably thinking about what is the best business direction? How can we, make the most money? Mm-hmm. As a designer, we have to think about those other things. It has to be technically feasible, so we have to understand the engineering side. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we live in a capital society, so whatever we do has to be business friendly. It has to make the company money.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what we really, really care about is this helping the people who are consuming this product? Mm-hmm. And I think that's like the biggest change in mindset that a lot of people have to make. Mm-hmm. And just being able to turn your own mind off and think like another person. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to do. Even as designers, we struggle with it every single day.
Yeah.
A lot of times we want to design for ourselves. There's a quote that gets thrown around a lot in design, which is, "You are not your user."
Yep.
You're absolutely not your user. Your teammates are not your user. No one in your company is your user. It's the actual user.
Yep.
So
you just really have to kind of nail down those personas and really think from their perspective, how they're going to feel, all that. So that this content is for the Agile community, and I think in Agile community we're talking a lot more about actually delighting the customers. Mm-hmm. And I mean that what you shared is a big piece of actually delighting the customer.
Yeah,
you can do amazing things, but if the customer is stuck and can't use it, is frustrated, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of spending millions of dollars on building the product. So
yeah,
that's a great mindset.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for coming and doing this interview. I think a lot of people are gonna get a lot of value out of this. I can already tell based on what you shared. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.